Everybody. Jay Widener, Reality Check, reading from the 2000 book, A Monument to the End of Time, Alchemy, Fulcanelli, and the Great Cross. And today we're going to be on chapter 2. And this chapter is titled A Mysterious Alchemist Adds a Chapter. All right, here we go. The Fulcanelli affair would be of interest only to specialists of occult history and abnormal psychology, except for the single mystery of the extra chapter. The second edition of Le Mystery, published in 1957, had a new chapter entitled The Cyclic Cross of Henday. In French, you would call it Unday, and a few changes in its illustrations. No mention of these changes appeared in Canseliet's preface to the edition. A few detractors, as early as the publication of Dwellings, had been suspicious that the whole affair was the work of a group of occult pranksters centered on the bookstore of Pierre Dujol in the Luxembourg district of Paris. The critics have archly suggested that was an obscure literary hoax, perhaps designed to give the Brotherhood of Heliopolis, as the group liked to call itself, the cachet of a real tradition. It must be admitted that if that were indeed the case, they failed miserably. Any motivation for a hoax seems to be lacking. None of the Brotherhood, such as it was, benefited from or capitalized on the supposed Fulcanelli's teachings, except Eugene Canseliet and possibly Jean-Julien Champagne, the artist who illustrated both volumes. The group, the Brotherhood of Heliopolis, seems to have remained small and closed, limited to Champagne and his friends, and faded away after his death in 1932. However, the publisher, Jean Chemet, assumed that Fulcanelli and Champagne were the same, and since he was the only objective observer on the scene, his opinion carries some weight. Certainly, if Champagne were not Fulcanelli, he was in fact his agent. Canseliet's role seemed to M. Chemet more of an amanuensis or secretary. Fulcanelli Devoile by Geneviève Dubois, a recent French examination of the Fulcanelli legend, even concludes that the work was a product of a committee with Pierre Dujol, who died in 1926, the year Mystery of the Cathedrals was published, supplying the scholarship, Champagne the operational skills, and Canseliet in charge of assembling the notes. But even if we agree, for the sake of argument, that Champagne and his friends are our best candidate for Fulcanelli's secret identity, the question remains, who wrote the extra chapter in the second edition of Mystery of the Cathedrals? Champagne was a quarter of a century dead when the second edition appeared. It is unlikely that he was the author, even though internal evidence suggests that it was written at least a decade before his death. With Canseliet's use of everything else by Fulcanelli, or Champagne and Dujol's, the Fulcanelli group, how are we going to account for the complete absence of reference to Henday in Canseliet's work prior to the mid-1950s? If the chapter is the work of Champagne, then Canseliet must have known about it. This is not a trivial question. The Henday chapter is perhaps the single most astounding esoteric work in Western history. It offers proof that alchemy is somehow connected to eschatology, that is, the timing of the end of the world, and offers the conclusion that a double catastrophe is imminent. If Canseliet had known of this, he would surely have used it or at least mentioned it, yet the absence is complete and compelling. So where did it come from? We do have one intriguing clue that serves to compound the mystery. In 1936, Jules Boucher, by Canseliet's recollection, a peripheral member of the group, but by his own account, an integral part, published a two-part spread in the obscure occult review Consolation on the Cross of Henday. Apparently an artist, the painter Lemoyne took some photos of the cross while vacationing near Henday and showed them to his friend, the editor of Consolation, Maurice Choisy. From there, Jules Boucher, a young occult writer, was commissioned to write an esoteric article on the cross. Boucher's article is significant for more than the differences between his version and that attributed to Fulcanelli than it is for any similarities. Boucher clearly understood enough of the symbology on the monument to unravel its secret, but he gave no hint of any deeper understanding of the cross. Fulcanelli, however, is direct and clear. He knows specifics and gives clues that can only come from direct knowledge. There is nothing to suggest that Canseliet copied Boucher's article and fabricated the new Henday chapter from it, but there is evidence that Boucher had been exposed somehow to the information in that chapter. The clue lies in Boucher's use of Fulcanelli's translation of the oddly spaced inscription on the front of the cross. Normally arranged, it is the simple, quote, "O cross, our only hope of thousands of cemetery monuments." But the S of the Latin spes, or hope, is displaced, cut off on the first line so that the inscription reads, "O crux ave pes unica." Boucher used what he perceives to be an extra oddity in spacing to suggest that it should read phonetically in French, "Au croix have espèce unique," or "Au cross the single pale space." This is how Fulcanelli phrased it in the new chapter. It is written that life takes refuge in a single space. From this, we can see that Boucher had heard or read Fulcanelli's version and then gone looking for its origin in the Latin phrase. But his derivation is flawed and yields only a close approximation to the phrase. As we shall find later, Fulcanelli meant just what he said about how to read the symbolic inscription. It becomes clear that Boucher was consulting a source that seems to be at least partially the text of the new Henday chapter. There is no evidence that Canseliet knew anything about Boucher's article. It was only rediscovered by researchers long after the second edition of Le Mystery was published and remains the only contemporary publication on the Henday cross. Therefore, Boucher's independent approach to the cross suggests that Fulcanelli was still in contact with some of his students, but not with Canseliet. So if Canseliet didn't copy Boucher and the rest of the group that was supposed to be Fulcanelli was dead when it was written, where did Canseliet get the new chapter? The only solution is that Canseliet met the real Fulcanelli again and got it straight from the source. And Canseliet claims that such a meeting actually took place in the Pyrenees in the early 1950s. While Henday is never mentioned in Canseliet's account, the story is quite spectacular in its strangeness. To place the tale of Canseliet's last encounter with Fulcanelli in any sort of context, we must cut through the tangled accounts of Canseliet's relationship with the master and establish a reasonable common denominator, chronology. Born in late 1899, Eugene Canseliet claimed to have met Fulcanelli shortly after the start of the Great War, while still an adolescent. The next year, he claimed to have met Champagne as another of Fulcanelli's students. Later in life, Canseliet declared that he had spent 15 years with Fulcanelli, implying, since they seem to have met in 1915, that he last saw the master in 1930. However, from the mid-1930s until Champagne's death in 1932, Canseliet lived across the hall from Champagne in a cold water walk-up of the Butte-Montmartre district. Therefore, Canseliet was the one person most likely to know if Champagne really was Fulcanelli, and to the end, Canseliet denied that Champagne was anything more than the illustrator. Even though Canseliet had the most to gain by perpetuating the myth of Fulcanelli, it is obvious there is something more than just self-serving egotism at work in its description of Fulcanelli. If Fulcanelli had really been de Jules or Champagne, then why would Canseliet continue the hoax long after they were dead? Why change the mystery of the cathedrals at all? Why not admit the whole thing and claim the credit? And yet Canseliet went to his grave declaring that Fulcanelli was a real person and was certainly not Champagne or de Jols. When our main witness insists on the truth of such a central fact, then it behooves us to listen. As we have seen, there is at least some independent evidence of Fulcanelli's existence. Therefore, let us take Eugene Canseliet at his word and see if we can find the truth of his relationship with Fulcanelli. Canseliet claims to have met the group around Fulcanelli just before the war and seems to have worked directly with them through the war years. Sometime after 1919, Fulcanelli seems to have faded from the scene as a direct presence. At least that is the assumption based on the admittedly conflicting evidence of Canseliet's changing versions of the story. But the contact with Fulcanelli, whoever he was, left the Brotherhood of Heliopolis, Canseliet, Champagne, and the rest in possession of several secrets, including the secret of physical transmutation, according to some of Canseliet's later accounts. In the mid-1970s, just a few years before his death, he told American occultist Walter Lang that he and Champagne and another brother, Gaston Savage, performed a transmutation in 1922 in the Municipal Gasworks Laboratory of Sarcelles, with a minute amount of the powder of projection given to him by Fulcanelli. In conversations with Albert Rydell, that would be Frater Albertus of the Paracelsus Research Society, Canseliet claimed that he performed the transmutation under Fulcanelli's direction. To some, this suggests that Fulcanelli was literally there in the room demonstrating the correct transmutative technique. Actually, Canseliet is saying no more than he was following Fulcanelli's directions, which he could have written down years before. Frater Albertus, however, had information from independent sources that Fulcanelli himself had performed a transmutation in Bourges in 1937 in the presence of Ferdinand Lesseps II and Pierre Curie. This would suggest that Boucher was right and Fulcanelli was still on the scene in the late 1930s. Unfortunately, Albertus does not supply us with the source of his information. Canseliet claimed to know nothing of the incident. It might be easy to dismiss it as one more occult fabrication, except for the mention of Lesseps and Curie. Canseliet confirmed that they were among Fulcanelli's large circle of friends. It is perhaps the early connection with scientists such as Curie that led OSS and other allied intelligence agencies to search for Fulcanelli immediately after World War II. Canseliet confirms this in his conversations with Frater Albertus and implies that they are still seeking him. So apparently Fulcanelli, on some level or other, seems to have been a real presence right through the end of the war in 1945. For a man who died or disappeared before 1926, if we were to take Canseliet's first preface to Mystery of the Cathedrals at face value, that's a pretty active record. However, by sifting through Canseliet's statements, we can determine a sort of minimalist timeline. From 1915 to around 1919, Canseliet was in direct contact with Fulcanelli. He visited Canseliet, perhaps to deliver the powder of projection and a stack of manuscripts at Sarcelles in 1922. Then Canseliet tells us his various accounts, he saw him again in 1930 and one more time, miraculously, in 1952. In many ways, this simplified chronology makes the most sense. Fulcanelli was never seen visiting Champagne or Canseliet because he wasn't in contact with them during the period that they lived next door to each other. He visited Canseliet at Sarcelles, and we are never told where the 1930 meeting took place. The literal absence of Fulcanelli explains many of the minor mysteries, such as the liberties that Canseliet and Champagne took with the project. Perhaps Canseliet truly meant what he said in the preface to the first edition of Mystery Cathedrals and never expected to see Fulcanelli again. What a shock when he returned in 1930 after both books had been published. Perhaps Fulcanelli wasn't pleased by what Canseliet and Champagne had done with his work. This might explain Champagne's sudden decline into apathy and alcoholism, which led to his death 2 years later. Certainly, Fulcanelli broke off contact with Canseliet, leaving him to his own devices. However, some sort of signal was arranged in case Fulcanelli ever wanted to get back in touch with Canseliet. We know this because something of that sort actually happened. In 1952, after almost 22 years, Canseliet met his master one last time. Before his death, Canseliet told the story in several versions to a number of friends and researchers. When he received the signal, Canseliet went to a specific city, perhaps Seville in Spain, where he was met by a car which drove him deep into the Pyrenees Mountains. Arriving at a large chateau, Canseliet was greeted by his old Fulcanelli, now looking the same age as Canseliet, then in his early 1950s, even though he had been around 80 in 1930. From here on, Canseliet's story becomes vague and dreamlike as shock piled upon shock. Like Parzival's first visit to the Grail Castle, wonders pass in front of Canseliet's without his ever asking the question why. And like Parzival, Canseliet ends up on the outside, the castle having vanished, wondering just what it was all about. He was given a room in an upper turret and a petit laboratoire in which to conduct his experiments. He was so impressed by the small laboratory that he began to wonder what the grand laboratory might be like in comparison. Gradually, he met the other visitors. It began to dawn on Canseliet that his master's chateau was a refuge for advanced alchemical adepts. That evening, he saw a group of small children dressed in 16th century clothes playing in the courtyard below his window. Canseliet, like Parzival, didn't think to ask any questions. He went to bed and soon forgot about it. Days passed with Canseliet happily puttering around in his laboratory. Fulcanelli stopped by occasionally to see how he was doing, but Canseliet is vague on their discussions. Then one morning, Canseliet awakened early and went downstairs into the courtyard for a breath of air without doing more than throwing on his clothes. As he stood there with his shirt unbuttoned and his braces hanging loose from his trousers, 3 women entered the courtyard chattering in happy feminine voices. Embarrassed, Canseliet froze, hoping that they wouldn't notice him standing in the doorway. As they passed, one of the 3 turned and looked directly at Canseliet and smiled. Shocked to his core, Canseliet recognized that the face of the young woman as that of his master Fulcanelli. Canseliet would talk and write about his visit to the castle of the adepts many times before his death, but he saved this gem of pure strangeness for his closest friends. It only appeared in print after his death in K.R. Johnson's Fulcanelli Phenomena, a book about which we will have much to say later on. The end of the story is very confused, but Canseliet eventually left the castle. Fulcanelli, however, gave him a word of warning before he left, reported by Canseliet in his 1964 edition of his book Alchemy. This time, quote, "This time will come, my friend, when you will no longer be able to work in alchemy, when it will become necessary for you to search for the rare and blessed land along the frontiers to the south," unquote. And this is as close as we get to the possible origin of the Henday chapter, the oblique mention of a disaster and a place of refuge. But for the reality of that additional chapter, it might be possible to dismiss the story as an old man's fabrication. Whatever really happened, the evidence forces us to accept that Canseliet met someone who delivered that apocalyptic chapter and ordered its publication in the new edition of Mystery of the Cathedrals. Applying Occam's razor suggests that Fulcanelli is the most likely source. And after that encounter, After that encounter, however, Fulcanelli seems to have truly vanished. Canseliet never saw him again, and neither has anyone else with any degree of certainty. And so that's the end of chapter 2. Um, Many of you may have recognized that Canseliet's strange story of him going to this medieval castle in the Pyrenees is very close to J.K. Rowling's first Harry Potter book. And you would be right, because I am absolutely certain that J.K. Rowling's inspiration for Harry Potter came from Canseliet's strange last encounter with Fulcanelli. Harry Potter goes to the castle. He goes to a train station, which in Canseliet's version, he went to the Seville, Spain train station, and there he was picked up by a car. He was blindfolded and taken up into this castle where everyone dressed in 15th and 16th century clothing, and they all practiced alchemy. And so I have no doubt in my mind that Harry Potter comes directly from the Fulcanelli legend. Um, so that's the end of chapter 2. Clearly, what we're saying is that Mystery of the Cathedrals was reprinted in the 1950s, and a new chapter had been added. And that chapter was The Great Cross of Henday. And that's what this book is about. And so in chapter 3, we will follow this mystery to its next level. I'm Jay Widener. This is Reality Check. I'm reading from the 2000 book, A Monument to the End of Time, Alchemy, Fulcanelli, and the Great Cross, written by me and the late, great Vincent Bridges. And I hope you enjoy it. And we'll be back next week for chapter 3. Thanks for watching.